Hello, History 72A Winter Quarter 2024. Lecture 10 is both longer than earlier lectures and more depressing. Because of both, I am going to break Lecture 10 into two parts. They need to go together to make the idea, but that does not mean that you must watch all of them in one go. I went back and forth on whether to arrange the lectures in Module C, principally by chronology or by region. In the end, I have decided to go by region to keep the connections over time more clear. This lecture stays in the Chesapeake. We will be moving forward in time here. That means that the next lecture, not part two of this one, but the next full lecture, we will be heading back a bit in time, as well as north to New England. In this lecture, we will pick up with our English younger sons and our masterless men. The masterless men generally ended up going through a period of having a master, meaning in this case, the person who owned their indenture contract, and supplying labor in order to get to the Virginia colony. We will look at the course that the English colonies in the Chesapeake took as land and indentured servants became more difficult to obtain. And we will be considering the ways that people in power in the Chesapeake region of what would become, but was not yet, the United States, deliberately wrote laws in order to create racialized, heritable chattel slavery. Finally, we'll look at one specific case as an illustration of how these laws actually worked on the ground for real people. The Morgan article that you have for this module gives you a much more complete and nuanced view. This lecture provides information that the Morgan article assumes the reader already knows. Indentured servitude existed in England before the colonization of North America. England had what, to me at least, and I acknowledge my historical viewpoint here, seems like an odd idea of family structure. Children of any class were sent away from their natal or birth family to be raised from around the age of 11. Children of the aristocracy went to boarding or finishing schools, depending on their sex. Young working class people became apprentices and went to live in the family of their so-called master. The word master in that situation applied to the degree of skill an artisan had achieved according to their professional guild. The trajectory was apprentice, journeyman, master. And this pattern for artisans had existed from at least the Middle Ages in Europe. Working class girls were generally sent into service before what we might call the tween years. They served an aristocratic or at least an elite family, returning to their parents only once or twice a year. The first lasting settlement in Virginia was founded by the Virginia Company in 1607. It was a money-making venture from the start and not particularly well thought out or organized. This really was one of the few English settlements hoping for strike it rich with gold, although those illusions faded quite quickly. The first group of settlers to arrive were, and this is a quote, a quarrelsome band of gentlemen and servants. These were almost all younger sons of the gentry with their personal servants, and they included very few people with practical skills like farming or building. You are looking at scans of some of the original Virginia Company of London documents. If you want a closer look at these and many more, they can be found at the Library of Congress website. This is a hint for primary sources for a project. The first group, sponsored by the Virginia Company, encamped in a coastal swamp that was chronically low on fresh water, but high on pathogens or disease-causing agents. Disease, starvation, and basic incompetence saw half of this initial group die in their first year in North America. The Virginia Company realized that super quick profits and precious metals were never going to happen, and they changed plans. They decided to guide colonists to focus on finding a marketable commodity and to encourage the immigration of more people with the skills needed to build a colony and keep the inhabitants there alive. And you'll see on this ad or this document, plantation here means actually planting people, moving people over and planting them. That will change later on. And it says, by the ancient planters now remaining alive in Virginia in 1624. To encourage immigration to North America, in addition to promotional advertising, which is what you see here, the Virginia Company established what is called the head right system. The Virginia Company had been granted land in North America by royal charter. They decided to distribute this land by awarding 50 acres to colonists for every passage they paid to Virginia for themselves and for anyone else. You might wonder why anyone with money would want to pay for someone else to travel to Virginia. Remember that displacement from the land and poverty were huge issues in England. These displaced people often had skills like farming and were accustomed to labor, but they did not have enough money to pay for their passage to North America, so they would sign an indenture agreement. In exchange for passage to the American colonies, these individuals would surrender their freedom for an agreed period of time, usually somewhere along the way of 5 to 7 years. One thing I should note here, indentures could be sold for work within the British Isles as well. The head right system was the idea of the Virginia Company, but indenture was already an established practice in England by then. During this period of servitude, an indentured person usually could not marry. You can see that in the part of this indenture contract that I have enlarged. This part here says, he shall not waste his master's goods, nor lend them unlawfully to any. He shall not commit fornication, that means having sex outside of marriage, nor contract matrimony within the said term, meaning the term of his indenture. Indentured servants were subject to beatings and had to do whatever work was required of them. But at the end of the set time, the indentured servant was free and got a payment called freedom dues. They could potentially buy land and become independent in a way that never would have been possible for them in England. As it happened, the Chesapeake continued to have a high death rate, and many of these indentured servants did not make it to the end of their terms. Individuals who had enough money to bring over a number of indentured servants ended up with large estates. Remember, 50 acres per passage paid, in addition to the work of the indentured servants to make that land profitable. The Virginia Company and the people who bought land and indentures just needed a commercial crop to grow in large amounts and sell specifically for profits. That crop turned out to be tobacco. The widespread use of tobacco in pipes made the people who owned tobacco plantations wealthy and meant grueling, backbreaking labor for those who did the actual work. Virginia's social structure actually began to look quite a bit like England. A wealthy landed gentry at the top, a group of small farmers, usually indentured servants who had managed to acquire some land somewhere in the middle, and a large group of poor laborers at the bottom. In the outer images on the slide here, you can see men on the left of the upper class and on the lower right here of the lower class. And they are holding clay pipes. You can barely see it there. Little bit easier to see here, especially when you know what you're looking for. You can see in both cases the juxtaposition of alcohol and tobacco, suggesting that tobacco smoking was a leisure activity for the English in many walks of life. The woman left of middle is upper class. The one right of middle in color is probably working class and Dutch. She's almost certainly a maid. The association of tobacco and alcohol is clear in the left-hand image, and the text under criticizes the use of both. In the painting with the young Dutch woman, it may be a bit more difficult to see the association with alcohol, but the bowl she holds in her right hand is probably a punch bowl. That's when you mix an alcohol like gin with water or with some other sort of liquid. Tobacco plantations required a massive amount of field labor, and initially indentured servants filled that role. In the minds of the English, women did not farm. When women did do farm work, as you can see they are doing on the slide with the tobacco, it was considered a temporary helping out thing, even if it lasted for years. This gendered idea of farming meant that men with enough money starting out imported male indentured servants, and as they died off or reached the end of their indenture, plantation owners imported more. In other words, Virginia had an extremely skewed sex ratio, with far more men than women. The few women who initially arrived generally came as indentured servants. They also frequently, as you see, helped out in the tobacco fields. Remember, helping out in this context could mean full-time labor. So officially not assigned to field labor, reality was something different. These women could not marry and start a family until the end of their indenture, relatively later in life. Infant mortality, like adult mortality, was high. The early Virginia settlers were either bachelors with money looking to make more money or desperate people hoping to survive. Things like stable families and education were not a high priority, and the dispersed settlement meant that there were not strong communities centered on shared beliefs, except the belief in making money and trying to emulate the English aristocracy with expensive high status goods imported from England. The overall effect was that white Virginia society was not, as it first took shape, centered on families, but on making money, and that the colony could not increase its population by natural means, meaning by sexual reproduction. Eventually, the Virginia Company literally advertised for English women to come to Virginia. Men with wives and children tended to settle and contribute a more stable stream of income for the company. You are looking at one of the land grant documents from the headright system on the left. On the right, 2 pages out of hundreds in the Virginia Company records from official meetings trying to solve the no women who want to stay in Virginia problem. Reading transcripts from some of them. November of 1619, quoting, Sir Edwin Sandys, treasurer of the company, wished that a fit 100 might be sent of women, maids, young and uncorrupt, to make wives to the inhabitants, who by defect thereof, and is credibly reported, stay there but to get something and then to return for England, which will breed a dissolution, and so an overthrow of the plantation. These women, if they marry farmers, to be transported at the charges of the company. And again, from 1621. Men, having gotten some wealth there, return again into England for the remedying of that mischief and establishing of a perpetuity to the plantation. Sandys advised to send them over 100 young maids to become wives, that wives, children, and family might make them less movable and settle them together with their posterity in that soil. Virginia continued to be a region of plantation agriculture. Notice the shift that's happening here. In the last slide, they're talking about planting people in the soil and having them stay. From this point, Virginia is a region of plantation agriculture in the sense that large pieces of land were owned by a small group of wealthy men who grew cash crops, initially tobacco, to sell and become more wealthy. Lower status small farmers and laborers did all of the actual physical labor. Laborers who died were replaced by new indentured servants from England, increasingly joined by enslaved people from Africa. Field labor demands continued to rise, and the death rate stayed high. Land became more difficult for indentured servants to acquire as the new elites consolidated their large plantations. Indentured servants who returned to England or wrote letters home exposed the reality in contrast to Virginia Company advertising. And the situation in England began to become somewhat less impossible for the poor. Fewer English people were willing to sign an indenture to get to North America, especially to Virginia. And as fewer Englishmen were willing to cross the Atlantic to work, plantation owners began to look elsewhere for cheap, exploitable labor. The image in the center here is clearly recent and not 17th century, but it gives you some idea of why tobacco is such a labor-intensive crop. The images to the sides are advertisements for tobacco grown in the Virginia colony and sold in London. And this one, you can see the owners who run the plantation sitting around here playing games, drinking alcohol, and smoking their tobacco pipes while enslaved people do the labor in the background. And here it shows the laborers doing the work in the foreground. In 1662, the colony, remember there were no states yet, the colony of Virginia passed a law that linked a developing construction of race to the concept of chattel slavery. Chattel means object through sex gender. And this is the law. It is called in Latin partus sequitur ventrum law. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. The Virginia colony law that I just read stipulated that the condition of freedom or unfreedom was inherited from the mother, breaking with the long-standing English system of tracing all important lineage questions through the father. Note that nothing else, name, title, land, money, nothing else would pass along the mother's line, only enslavement. The writing of the 1662 law is considered an important watershed in American history, but also it fits into a bigger picture already developing in the Anglophone Atlantic. Anglophone is English speaking. People often notice this bit of a fine. So that's where you can see already there was some tendency to try to create race and to separate people. The linked constructions of race and unfreedom did not take exactly the same shape in all British colonies nor in England itself. You see this to an extent in the Morgan article. By the late 17th century, the English had taken over the slave trade almost entirely and were making money not just from the labor of enslaved people, but from their commodified bodies. The English were already thinking about how to justify the mass enslavement of fellow humans. The perceived need for many people to do difficult labor corresponded to the development of plantation agriculture in the British colonies beyond the Americas. Plantations in the Caribbean region required massive amounts of labor to produce sugar, and they were death traps for the people doing that labor. In the calculus of early capitalism, it was more lucrative to work enslaved people to death and replace them with newly enslaved people than to keep a workforce alive. None of the English enslavers, traders, or foremen were ignorant of the degree of harm they were inflicting on fellow humans. They made the choice to do so regardless. The English took over the big money-making trade in captive humans at the same time that English colonists in plantation regions were searching for a cheap, exploitable source of labor. But the English and English colonists had not figured out exactly what form the justification for enslavement would take. Experiments were situational. In the Caribbean, some English fathers would leave estates to children they had with an enslaved woman. This was something that did not happen in the Chesapeake. You've seen that the English considered themselves superior to other people on the great chain of being, but that they also were constantly anxious about losing their supposedly innate superiority. The question was, which type of human variability to use to sort another group far enough below the English to justify their permanent enslavement. Think about my Brussels sprouts societies from long ago. The English turned to the people they were already enslaving and shipping across the Atlantic, and settled on African ancestry as the variable of disempowerment, and then linked that to skin tone. This construction took shape in many of the British colonies in the Americas and in England itself. Both the Morgan and Brown pieces that you have to read try to situate the mindset that could accept this justification in an historical context. This is an advertisement for enslaved people. When you look at the Brown chapters, this is the big point that I want you to get. And in this case, Kathleen Brown, same one who wrote the Thomas Thomasine article, but in this case, I've given you chapters from a book that she wrote, a monograph called Foul Bodies. This construction of justification for enslavement is the big point that I want you to get. Not that enslavement was inevitable, but the extent and nature of anxieties that the English drew on to justify making their choices. This is one of the places where no single explanation is the one. Remember that most thoughts or actions have more than one motivation, and those motivations can actually be in direct conflict with one another. A corollary to this is that the justifications for harming others are rarely logically consistent. The 1662 Virginia law was not alone responsible for the development of racialized, heritable chattel slavery in the future U.S., but that law crystallized not only a particular way of justifying enslaving people for labor, it also reflects a tipping point in the process of defining who could and could not be enslaved going forward in the context of developing British colonies in North America. You get specific examples of how the 1662 Law of Virginia developed in the Morgan reading, as well as a look at how the humans who would suffer from the law sought to work out solutions to protect their families in the short term. I am not quizzing you on the Morgan reading, but it is one that I would like you to gut and then read if at all possible. In video lectures, I'm going to go to the neighboring colony of Maryland to show how much effort was required to create the race-enslaved linkage. It took deliberate intent to make both constructions, race and hereditary enslavement, and to make a link between them seem natural to Americans in later generations. This sequence of maps over time shows just how massive the transatlantic slave trade became. It was completely out of proportion to any other form of enslavement before or after. The slave trade was incredibly lucrative, meaning money making, for those who controlled it on both sides of the Atlantic. Britain and its North American colonies. And the long-term effects of this inconceivably huge forced migration through enslavement stretched well beyond the Atlantic world. In the earliest years of settlement in Virginia, slaves of African origin labored in tobacco fields side by side with indentured servants from England. Runaway ads show us that they also escaped with one another, and legal records show that actual people established intimate relationships across the indentured enslaved line and blurred that line with the families that they created. And that was where the problem lay when it came to constructing the fiction that any African ancestry was linked to inferiority and that any African ancestry could be reliably linked to skin color. Humans, variable as we may be, are all human, and it became clear as families formed and had children with both African and English ancestry, and even more as those children formed families in adulthood and had children of their own, that there was no perfect coordination between skin pigmentation and having some African ancestry. Even more, these mixed ancestry families, as well as the free families formed initially by two people of African descent, showed that it did not matter what continent a person or their ancestors came from. They could all be and were beloved parents, children, siblings, friends, colleagues, and so on. It was difficult to justify enslaving someone's beloved and very human family member. Virginia's partus sequitur ventrum law had two big goals. Wealthy Anglo-American colonists intended, first, to keep enslaved people from forming secure family structures, and then to use the lack of secure family structure among enslaved people to maintain the fiction that skin color was somehow linked to inferiority. Note that the Virginia law did not prevent white men from having sex, consensual or not, with an enslaved woman. The first part here says, whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free. At this point, the penalty down here was fairly light, if it was imposed on a white man at all. And we can tell from the wording of the law that English men were already having children with women of African descent. Recall the first line of the law. Some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be free or slave. Later laws would ostensibly make all sex between the races illegal, but a law is only meaningful in its enforcement. By the time those laws came through, people labeled as Black could no longer testify in courts or serve on juries. This meant that male plantation owners could father children with enslaved Black women, and the existence of those children, his children, would increase his enslaved property. Those children could be, and often were, sold away from the plantation where they were conceived and born, sometimes with, but often without, their mother. If you have done the reading for this lecture package or module, then you also know that the laws establishing racial slavery did not come into being fully formed and effective. They were written and rewritten over the years in response to actual humans on the ground who inconveniently produced relationships and children which could threaten the establishment of racialized chattel slavery. But these laws were not applied to white men who enslaved other human beings. In other words, you couldn't form a family, but you could make yourself more enslaved people as property. I have the Loving versus Virginia legal decision on the right for a few reasons. One is to show that these laws intended to separate human beings, the laws to construct a particular power vector, did not go away quickly, even in just the region of Virginia. They were adapted when Virginia became a state in the new United States rather than a colony of Great Britain. They were adapted through all of the supposed advances in science and knowledge about humans through the 19th and 20th centuries. In fact, the laws became ever more draconian or stiff in the wake of the Civil War and the legal, if not always actual, emancipation of people judged to be Black. I was born in 1966. The removal of laws against interracial marriage was not even attempted. The removal was not attempted on a national level until my lifetime. This is the end of Lecture 10, Part 1. Key points will be at the end of Lecture 10, Part 2. Bunnies are there because I find them restorative. For the most part, they are incapable of doing much harm to anything but plants and electrical cords.